Hi, my name is Mitchell German. I'm the author of Your Storytelling Potential and the creator of the software Plot Control. In this short video, I'd like to explore this concept of story structure. Chances are, if you are a novelist or a screenwriter, whether you've written anything successfully or you're just aspiring or you haven't even taken a crack at writing a screenplay or a novel, you've inevitably heard about this concept of story structure, which is rooted in the foundation of what's called the 3 acts. On my screen, you can actually see a very typical way that many experts will teach story structure. And what you've got here is Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And essentially what they will tell you is that great story structure and proper story structure is built on this foundational idea of 3 acts. And there is ascending action. They use a line that looks like this to show as the story moves forward, progresses through the 3 acts, the action becomes more and more and more and more until you eventually get to the beginning of the Act 3 where there's a climax and there's a resolution, and that action then descends into the finale, the end of your story. You're also going to come across many different variations of story structure. For instance, another classic way of thinking about story structure, and this specifically does apply to movie writing and screenplays, is Sid Field's paradigm. And in Sid Field, I certainly would never take even a moment of my time to knock Sid Field. He truly was the first one to reverse engineer and dissect the really amazing movies that were being made back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And he looked at these movies and he said, this is what's going on. He recognized certain aspects and ideas within story structure and events that need to take place, such as an inciting incident and different plot points. He understood and recognized that in most stories, there is not only 3 acts, Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, but there was a Part 1 and Part 2 of Act 2. So Act 2 had 2 distinct halves separated by what is called the midpoint. You also see something called Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was a teacher who reverse engineered classic literature, and he came up with what is called his monomyth. And he came up with a structure that looks like this. It's often written as a circular pattern because at the end he always has the hero, in his case, because the hero returns with the elixir. The hero returns home. So there's a call to adventure, he calls it, and the hero ventures out into the world of the story, has whatever the trials and tribulations that are required to overcome whatever is going on in the story. Ultimately, it goes full circle and he returns with the elixir. Now, the problem with Joseph Campbell's monomyth, because it's a very popular way of thinking about story. So before you run out and start to construct your stories based on this, and I will admit myself, it's very inspiring. It gets your imagination going in terms of what he teaches and says about stories and story structures and archetypes. It's inspiring. I acknowledge that and I get that. But you need to be very careful of what you think about story structure and how you try to build and construct your own screenplays and stories and novels. Because the problem is, going back to the standard 3-act structure, is that all these experts who try to explain story structure, and you'll find different versions of this. You'll find 4 acts, you'll find 6 acts, and 12 acts. These are different popular versions, essentially, of 3-act structure. What these experts do is they take this classic 3-act structure and they say, actually, there's 2 parts to Act 1, 2 sequences to Act 1. And then, Act 2, which already has the 2 parts. So someone who will tell you there's 4 acts in great stories. What they'll do is say, well, there's Act 1. Then Act 2 is really 2 acts. So Act 2, Act 3, and then the final act is Act 4. And this is actually a fundamental, critical mistake that these so-called experts are doing. And if you are an aspiring writer trying to put together great stories, it's important that you understand foundationally what is happening in stories without getting caught up and stuck in the way of thinking about story structure in terms of acts, because there are definitely 3 acts. And different experts, again, whether they say it's 4 acts or 6 acts or 12 acts, all they're doing is breaking up the essential 3 acts, because ultimately Act 1 is just the introduction to your story. That's what happens in Act 1. Act 2 is where the meat, if you will, of a lot of the story progression and is explored. The ideas are explored. Thematic ideas are explored, and that's where the bulk of the energy of exploration of how to resolve whatever is going on in the story happens. There's complications and failures and journeys that all happens within Act 2. Ultimately, we get to the end of Act 2, and we get to Act 3, and that's the ending. So you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, fundamentally. That's core basic story structure. The problem is for a writer, for a storyteller, and it doesn't matter if you're writing screenplays or novels or some kind of other story, that is not enough information to act on. This is far too basic. Stories that are being really recognized for their greatness, the screenplays that are written, that are chosen to be made into movies, the screenplays that are being selected by producers and managers and agents to be represented and studios to be produced, and the ones that get a cast and get a director attached and get financing attached and ultimately get made, they're far more complex, far more layered than this image represents. And this is really essential because, yes, simple story structure does accurately reflect the movies and novels that get made. The problem is those movies and novels are actually far more complex than this. The other problem with this image that you need to be careful about is this, as you can see, there's a very popular image that looks like this, and it says ascending action. There you go, ascending action. The setup, ascending action, descending action. This is not correct. What this is ascending tension. The tension builds. And this is actually incorrect because it should be the tension builds to actually a key moment at the middle of your movie. And then the tension notably changes at that midpoint. It doesn't build to the story doesn't move from the beginning to the end of Act 2. That's an absolute incorrect way to think about storytelling. The proper way to think about storytelling is that the beginning moves to the midpoint. From the midpoint, we move to the ending. So this image, although it accurately explains and describes a very cursory, simplistic view of story structure, it's actually insufficient for you to go and build your own stories with. And what I like to do for the next few minutes in this video is show you a better way to think about story structure. The same thing goes for Sid Field's paradigm. And again, I already said I would never knock Sid Field, but it is too simplistic because it's very two-dimensional. And what we need to think about is our stories in 3- and 4-dimensional way, because those are the stories that are getting made. The stories that are being made successfully, the books that are being recognized, the books that are being recognized and the screenplays that are being recognized and being made into movies are much more complex than is reflected in this image. And then you see something like Joseph Campbell's Monolith. This is actually not what happens at all. First of all, it's very vague. You know, supernatural aid, belly of the whale, women as a temptress, the ultimate boon, rescue from without, master of 2 worlds. I mean, like I said, it's very inspiring. This information, the way he describes stories, it's inspiring. And it does, you know, and I have nothing against being inspired and getting that imagination going. That's a major part of obviously being a storyteller and a writer and a screenwriter and a novelist. But this is not useful information at all. So trying to think about your stories with this information, it's actually quite damaging. So rather than use these kind of ways, in my book, Your Storytelling Potential, in my system, in my software called Plot Control, we take a very different approach to story structure. Now, it's definitely, foundationally, based on 3 acts. Fundamentally, all stories, all great stories, are fundamentally going to be 3 acts. But what we do is we break story down to look more like this. And we're much more specific in terms of what happens in each act. Rather, we think about very specific milestones and events that need to happen within structure. And this is really critical because we're thinking about the specific events. Not so much story structure in terms of beginning, middle, and end. Rather, we've got the introduction to the story, the main character. And in fact, we talk about introducing not just the main character, but another character called the proximate cause character. The problem or opportunity, which is usually called an inciting incident or catalyst. We've got solutions and escalations because we talk about and think about exactly what the main character needs to do. We don't just say they engage the story or there's a problem or opportunity. No, we talk about, in my system, what exactly you as the writer should be thinking the main character is doing. The main character takes action. There is a problem or opportunity. Well, what do they do? How do they try to resolve that problem or opportunity? And then ultimately what ends Act 2 is always a complication or failure. A complication or journey. Not just a plot point. We don't just say at the end of Act 1 there's a plot point. No, there is a complication or journey that's needed. This is how you create and craft and think about a really great Act 1. Now, what goes along with this is there's a personal goal that's introduced, reasons and logic, there's a logical solution, and then there's a primary obstacle. So there's layers already taking place. And what I'm going to show you is where you can think of these specific concepts within my software and is explored within my book. So that when you know, for instance, what is the logical solution, well, you know what happens here. So, and I'm going to show you that you don't need to think about storytelling within the confines of structure. Rather, what you're going to learn is how to think about storytelling without the confines of structure. Because one of the big mistakes that most writers make when they start to learn storytelling and they start to learn about structure is they start to conflate structure with the events that are taking place. And what my system, and I'm going to show you in a moment, lets you do is break apart that conflation and rather think about what happens. What has to happen here? 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 And then think about all those whats. And I'll show you in a second how you do that. And then once you know the whats, then it's easy to put the structure together. Well, I know what's going to happen. Well, when does that need to happen? It needs to happen here. So Act 2, we do the same thing. Act 2, we've got obstacles, success or failure. This is a critical moment. This is the midpoint of a great story. It's always a success or failure moment. The sequence that leads up to the middle of your story. Despair and transformation always follows your midpoint. And then there's going to be a key discovery that's going to end Act 2. That's going to reveal a real deep insight for the main character and for other characters potentially of how the story, the situation needs to be resolved. Then Act 3 is about reversals. Because of the discovery, everything reverses. Think about all the great stories you like, you've watched, the great movies. Think about what happens as they get towards that climatic moment. There's always some kind of new information, discovery, revelations, and that new information then reverses the whole story, and all of a sudden there's reversals, there's a climax, a resolution, and then reveal potential. And reveal potential is absolutely an essential, critical idea that you will learn in my book, Your Storytelling Potential, to learn about, is that what's going on, you've probably heard this concept of the character arc. Well, the character arc is yet another inaccurate way to think about storytelling, because what happens with a character, the transformation that a character undergoes during a great story, that character arc is really what we call reveal potential, because it's just that they realize what their potential was all along. It's not like something new happens to them, or new situation, new information about themselves comes out. Rather, what happens is they realize what their true potential was the whole time. So this is a better way to think about story structure, and every single act then gets broken down further, and we understand how you introduce what's called an A story and a B story. There's 2 stories, always 2 stories, never one story. And this is where complexity of structure and storytelling is really essential. You can't think about story structure in a simple way. You need to think about story structure in a much more complex and accurate way. And I'm not saying difficult. I'm not saying that it's going to be difficult to put these stories together. I'm saying that you need to think about it in a more complex way with what we call an A story and B story. We're not talking about subplots here. We're talking about a second story, a major story, two major storylines. And this is Act 1. The same for Act 2 and then also Act 3. And the way what we do in my system and your storytelling potential and with my software plot control is we use the core elements. The core elements, these 12 core elements are all the what's. What is happening in your story? And then we take these what's and we put them into the timeline, the structure timeline, what I call the simple story timeline. And with that, we then take the what's. When you figure out all the what's happening in your story, and what this does is it lets you stop thinking about your story in terms of structure. It lets you take a big, giant step back, get that 30,000-foot view, and know what is happening in your story. And not worry about when these things are going to happen. You figure out all the things that need to happen in your story first, and then you simply apply the different events that need to take place, the different elements that need to take place, the different thematic ideas. That's the bottom layer. Here's the thematic layer, right? The thematic layer and how it all builds directly into your stories. And this is just a much better way to think about building and using story structure.